Hello, everybody, and welcome to my week 3 lecture. This week we actually cover several topics in corrections, and that includes diversion, probation. As part of probation, I'm going to talk a little bit about motivational interviewing. It's one of the current buzzwords that we have in corrections. And then we're also going to talk about intermediate sanctions. So let's jump right in because this is a little bit more in depth. First, when we take a look at diversion. Now, diversion is going to be formally defined as anything that is done to halt or at least temporarily suspend kind of that formal criminal justice process. Ultimately, diversion can be before trial, it can be during trial, and it can be after trial. It could be law enforcement, it can be the prosecuting attorney, or it can be a judge. And that's one of the things where diversion is very generally defined. And so ultimately, all it really means is the halting or the um, interception of the formal criminal justice process. Diversion generally comes in two different types. We have what are called unconditional diversion programs. Now, an example of this is what is known as TAS, or Treatment Alternatives to Street Crime. This actual program began in 1972, but really got popular in the late 90s. And this was actually, the program began as an alternative for law enforcement. And basically, they were continually dealing with street crime by drug addicted individuals who basically were committing crime to pay for their drugs. They weren't big time drug dealers. They were people who suffered from addiction and were committing crime in order to continue their addiction. And so rather than arrest them and bring them through the process, they gave them an alternative saying, basically it says, if you go to treatment, and we will even bring you in the very first program, we will even bring you to the treatment program, and then we won't prosecute. But it was unconditional. If they didn't successfully complete the program, if they left on their own, it was their choice. But it was really trying to give an option because basically we learned that just arresting these folks didn't do any good. Now, another type of diversion is called conditional diversion. And this is a little bit more structured. And probably the best example of conditional diversion is drug court. Now, through your discussion post, I know some of you are familiar with drug courts. It's also a type of intermediate sanction. But basically, this says if you satisfactorily complete something, then we'll either not charge you or reduce the charges, or maybe reduce your penalties. So, for example, someone who qualifies for drug court, has to be a drug crime, will go to drug court. Drug court is very much focused on accountability and treatment. And so, as a diversion program, so it's outside of that formal criminal justice process, as a diversion program, if someone successfully completes drug court, again, those options are, to reduce some of the penalties of the formal process. However, if they don't successfully complete drug court, and that's why we call it conditional, then they will go forward with the traditional criminal justice process. No matter whether we have unconditional or conditional diversion, they all have basically three goals. We're trying to reduce crime. Again, recidivism is that term that we use for repeat criminality. And really what we're trying to do is reduce those levels of repeat crime. We also want to avoid the label or the stigma that often comes with a criminal record. I remember when I was working in probation, there were so many times where offenders would say, you know what, you might as well tattoo felon across my head, because once you get into that system and get that label, it's really hard to get rid of it. And so these types of programs allow us to kind of detour around that. And the bottom line, it saves money. Of course, where we are in a time frame and have been for several years, our criminal justice system is very, very expensive. And these types of options are significantly less expensive than some of their counterparts. Diversion programs, especially the conditional ones such as drug court, do have a lot of supporters. People think it's a great idea. It gives some options. It really deals with those underlying causes. Where again, just arresting, a drug addict doesn't do a lot of good. There isn't really any deterrence in just making that arrest. Where these types of diversion programs really give them options for treatments. Some of the criticisms, basically, some don't like, especially the unconditional diversion programs, because ultimately we're sending someone to treatment, but we haven't even formally charged them. And so some people argue that we're really giving up freedom without prosecution. Some argue that we're postponing the inevitable. And sometimes that's the truth. Um, when we go to drug court, we make that investment, we spend the money to get them into treatment and to follow the rules of drug court. And not everybody's going to be successful. And then we have the additional cost of then putting them through the formal criminal justice process. All right. Probation is simply defined as a conditional release in the community under supervision. And so again, very, very general defined, it's conditional release in the community. It is by far our most widely used sanction. A lot of stereotypes or misconceptions out in the public. We use probation. I have had murderers on my probation caseload, all the way down to some petty theft. So for misdemeanors as well as felonies, probation remains our most widely used sanction. And again, similar reasons for the goals, community-based. Again, and these first two tie together. Keeping individuals in the community is really, really important. We want to keep them when they have ties to community. A lot of times we want to continue that. And that also avoids the label. Mainly when we're talking about going to prison, that in itself creates a label. And so by allowing someone an opportunity to try probation and be successful on probation, there is some stigma. Granted, there's still stigma. They still have a criminal history, but it avoids some stigma. Probation is significantly cheaper. Um, Overall, on average, probation costs somewhere between, depends on the type and the jurisdiction, anywhere between, I've seen as low as $2, average is about 7, all the way up to 20. Probation is also considered fair. Now, you need to remember that most of the crime that comes to the criminal justice system is not your violent murderers. So yes, I said I've had um, murderers on my probation caseload, but that was obviously the very, very smallest percentage. A lot of these are property crimes, even some person crimes, but ultimately we know that not everybody needs to go to prison as the punishment. We simply can't afford to send everybody to jail or prison, and so this is really seen as a fair option. Probation comes with a lot of goals. Obviously, protecting the community is in the forefront. Really, what probation is doing is executing the court order. Remember, it's the judge that determines probation is going to be the sentence. We do a lot of assessment. We are assessing for risks and needs, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. We're really there to support victims. In part of the probation order might be um, to collect restitution. And of course, that goes right to the victims. We might moderate or facilitate restorative justice, victim offender mediation. So we really work hard at supporting victims as part of what we do in probation. And then ultimately, we are a service broker. You think of your stockbroker, and really they're just connecting you. They're taking your money and connecting it with different funds. We're doing the same with community services. So through that assessment, if you need drug treatment, I'm gonna broker that for you, saying, okay, here's a treatment program that fits your needs as well as your risks. This is where you're gonna go. Or you need education, you're gonna go here. Anger management, different types of services. So really, that's a lot of what we do. We facilitate their connection to whatever they've been ordered to do. When we're talking about who's on probation, basically when we look at the population of the United States, 1 out of every 53 people is on probation. The average probation length is 27 months. The vast majority of probationers are male. 56% are white. 62% will successfully complete it. Now, people argue it's kind of interesting. Is that a good number? Is that a bad number? We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. And again, I've already talked a little bit about the cost. Again, I've seen some probation as low as $2 a day, upwards of $20 a day. Average is generally 5 to 7, maybe 8, 9. Again, it really depends on what level of probation we're talking about. But the bottom line, when we consider jail or prison is anywhere between $75 and $150 a day, it's a cost savings. I live in Minnesota, and Minnesota is one of the top 5 states who do use probation. Other states, Washington, Delaware, Idaho, as well as Rhode Island, also use probation the most. Probation can be administered through several different entities. And again, similar to other classes, your professors will tell you it's really important for you to get to know how your state does things. You know, we had you do that assignment on your state as far as determinate or indeterminate sentencing. You'll also be doing other assignments that are state specific. It's really important for you to understand how your state does their corrections because it does vary from state to state. Technically, probation is a function of the court system. And so some jurisdictions are going to have probation where the probation officer works for the courts. Some jurisdictions have it where the probation is run as a part of corrections. Now, it's considered technically part of the court because, of course, it's the judge who issues probation. The administration is what varies. Now, depending on the level of offense, as well as differing states, some states, all of their probation services are run by the state, where they only have state-level probation officers. Some states have county-based probation officers, where each individual county has their own probation department. Some states, such as Minnesota, have a combination thereof. There is what is known as the Community Corrections Act. Now, this is a national act, so other states other than Minnesota has this. And basically, this is where we have some counties that are generally in close geographic areas to each other will basically join together to provide services. A lot of times those services might be administered from the state, but it's really it's an attempt to share resources. We have a lot of very small counties, very rural counties in Minnesota, so it only makes sense for them to share some of those resources. We're also seeing a move to privatization. So when we talk more about jails and prisons, we'll talk about some private jails and prisons. So basically, these are private companies, for-profit companies, who contract with agencies to provide probation services. Now, the very, very loaded question, does probation work? Now, I said earlier that 62% will successfully complete their probation. Now, that is an overall number. Where ultimately, we really need to look at the difference between misdemeanors and felonies. Misdemeanor offenders are much more likely to successfully complete their probation. Actually, about 75%, give or take, will successfully complete their probation. But basically, about 2/3 of felons on probation will be arrested, generally within a 3-year time frame. And so, we really need to take that into perspective. However, when we ask that question and why it says, or why I say it's a loaded question, we measure probation by recidivism. And so we only look at repeat criminality as kind of our determiner on whether or not does probation work. We simply look at recidivism rates or repeat criminality. The APPA, which is the American Probation and Parole Association, basically says that might not be the best measure. So when I worked in the field, one of the caseloads I had was an intensive management. These were people that had a lot of issues and have had a life of crime. Maybe not necessarily major crime, but have really spent their entire life committing crime. For example, I had several offenders who never had a legal job. And so were very, very difficult because then the judge would order their probation and say, okay, the first thing on your order of probation is to get a job. Well, when you're 40 years old and have never had a legal job, when we're trying to create a resume, What can we put on your resume? Yeah, I was a drug dealer. Um, it's really really challenging. And so rather than just measuring recidivism, the APA recommends that we look at things such as the amount of restitution collected. Again, we work with victims, and when an offender is paying their restitution, and if they're paying it as a condition of their probation, then that's a good thing. We need to look at that as a success. Same with those who are paying their fine. Or did they successfully, were they in treatment and they stayed in treatment in a drug treatment program for 3 weeks? For some individuals, that's a great success. Or they actually got a job and they kept it. I remember having like a little mini party um, to celebrate someone. She kept the job for 2 weeks, and that was the longest she had ever worked at one place in her life. And so we really tried to look at that as a success. Look what you learned during that. And again, it's baby steps a lot of times with some of these offenders. So, um, some people say, okay, by having those other measures, is that a cop out? Um, I like to look at it as when we have such a small definition of success in recidivism, we're really ignoring a big part of what we do. So no matter how we measure it, when we talk about what makes probation effective, again, the APPA has some suggestions. The first thing is to individualize our plans. That's one reason we do so much assessment, trying to figure out what an individual's needs are, as well as their risks. And once we've done that, how can we help enforce those pieces? Investing in treatment surveillance. So right now we're very much focused on that assessment. So we get you all assessed, but then sometimes we drop the ball. And so really focusing on, meeting whatever those needs are. A lot of times they are treatment. So helping them get into the treatment and then really providing surveillance to ensure they're following through. We also can do better on demonstrating that probation is tough on crime. Um, sometimes, and I've had offenders tell me, it's easier to go to prison than to be on probation. To be on probation is hard. It requires a lot of accountability, and so can be tough on crime. When we're looking at populations that probation works best, we're really talking about drug offenders. And so when we look at who is it most effective, we really need to do look more at drug offenders. The last thing we need to do is figure out to look at the research and what works. Now, something that we're going to be talking about throughout the quarter is called evidence-based practices. And really, these are through research. We have been able to demonstrate what works and what doesn't. And so we take now that evidence that we have, this data, and put it into practice. And again, we call that evidence-based practices, but really all it's doing is creating a probation plan based on data of what we know or has demonstrated itself to work. Basically, when we look at what probation officers do, we can really break it down into two different categories. The first is that case investigation, and a lot of times we are getting the cases before the person has been formally sentenced. The judge, after someone has been found guilty, the judge might order a pre-sentence investigation, or what we refer to in the field as PSI. And ultimately, what this involves is the probation department to meet with the offender and start that assessment process. Because once we've done the assessment and developed some needs and some goals, we will then turn that over to the judge to develop a treatment plan. And hopefully they're going to take that into consideration for sentencing. And one of the primary ways we do that, again, is through what's known as a risk and needs assessment. Now, a couple of the primary ones that are used in the field. It's actually the LSI, it's the level of service inventory. The dash R is just the revised. And now we have the level of service case management inventory, which is a even new improved assessment tool. Basically, these are computerized tools that go through, they have several different categories. You go through each category asking questions of the offender, and it is extremely comprehensive. We are asking things involved looking for risks and needs involved with their family and their employment and their education and their chemical health and their home environment. all of the things. We're wraparound services. We're as comprehensive to their life because ultimately we know the only way we can really help someone is to understand all of the pieces of the puzzle. And that's really what this type of assessment allows us to do. So once we've done that assessment, developed a treatment plan, we then go into more of a supervisory role where they have the treatment plan, we broker those services, we intervene when necessary. People are going to stumble, and so sometimes we just need to intervene, and sometimes it's just providing some clarity or maybe even a warning. And we really do that. We're providing surveillance. We're monitoring their compliance with the plan. We are their cheerleader, um, yet we're really monitoring their compliance. And then lastly, we are the enforcers. If they are not following through or they're not being accountable, it's really up to the probation officer to enforce um, the the conditions of that probation order. Probation does have a high level of burnout, and some of that burnout is simply because of our caseload size. Really, when you look at it, so um, average caseload size is anywhere between 120 and upwards of 200. I've seen caseload size. Actually, I've seen caseload sizes a little bit higher than that. It really depends on the level of supervision. We have to remember that, ultimately we have, about 120 hours available each month of work. And so, depending on the level of supervision, let's say each vendor requires just one meeting a month. There's travel time, there's paperwork, and ultimately you never feel caught up. I will openly admit, you never ever feel caught up, and really you just need to be okay with that. We are seeing some technological innovations. One of them is called probation automated management, and these are actually kind of cool. We don't have them in my jurisdiction, but it basically looks like an ATM machine where the person gets a card. It's like looks like a little credit card. They slide that in, and then they can type or even voice activate how they're doing. They can make a deposit as far as paying restitution. Some are so advanced as they can give a breath test. There's camera systems and a breath tube right on it. And so really we're seeing a lot of innovations in technology that helps us manage those caseload sizes, which hopefully will eliminate some of that burnout. Now, again, there's a lot of misconceptions about revoking probation. Just because someone violates a condition of their probation does not mean they're automatically going to be revoked. As a probation officer, I do have the authority to kind of tweak their conditions of probation. However, if we do decide to recommend that their probation being we recommend that their probation be revoked, it requires a hearing. Gagnon versus Scarpelli is actually the Supreme Court ruling that basically says probationers deserve the same due process rights as parolees get if we're going to be revoking their parole. And that actually, so that was it's kind of interesting that Morrissey versus Brewer is the Supreme Court case that says parolees have the right to due process. Gagnon versus Scarpelli happened a year later and said that due process also needs to be applied to those on probation who are recommended to have that probation revoked. And then ultimately, that is the judge's decision. That revocation can be because of two basically different things. The first is a new offense. They've committed another crime that generally will automatically revoke their probation, but it still needs to go through the judge. The second type of revocation could be on a technical violation. But again, just because someone has a technical violation doesn't mean that we are going to automatically revoke their probation. We do have some discretion and some leniency. However, let's say it's their third warning or their third failed drug test. We're going to file the paperwork with the judge as a recommendation to revoke that probation. But again, ultimately, it's the judge's decision. We can also do or request what's known as an A&D order. It's apprehension and detention. That's basically if we have information that someone has violated their probation to the point that we want to process the revocation paperwork, we can put out a warrant for their arrest. I have that authority. It's not a police officer. It's not a court warrant. It's called an A&D order. Still is a warrant served by law enforcement and arrests that person and brings them to court. One of the other buzzwords that we're seeing in probation right now is called motivational interviewing. And again, I'm going to be talking about this all quarter. Motivational interviewing is basically now how probation used to be. When I actually first started in probation, it was very much, I am the boss. I will tell you what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it. And you're going to follow my orders because that's just the way it is. I'm the probation officer. I have the power. We've learned that that might not be the best option, in that telling someone to do something because you said so, I even think of my own parenting experience, telling my kids to do it just because I said so isn't necessarily effective. However, if I can present an idea and a motivation to go with that idea and make you think it's your idea, you're going to have buy-in. And so motivational is very positive based. Dr. Bill Miller is one of the founders of motivational interviewing, and basically it's a conversation that basically helps someone help themselves change. And in order to be effective at motivational interviewing, you have to first figure out where someone is at. And so we call it the stages of change. And there are basically 5 different stages of change, where pre-contemplation is the person does not see that they have a problem. And so that really, as an agent, that really tells me, okay, where I need to back up to start these conversations, because I can't convince someone to go to treatment or that treatment is going to be a good thing for them if they don't think they have a problem. So pre-contemplation is that they don't think they have a problem. They don't need treatment. Yes, they drink every single day to the point of intoxication, but they don't have a problem. So that's really going to mold this conversation and where I need to start. Contemplation is they're starting to recognize that, okay, yep, I do drink to the point of intoxication every day. And yeah, there might be some consequences. My family has, stepped away from me. I miss them. So contemplation is they're not jumping into treatment, but they're starting to recognize that they have a problem. And so again, I'm going to mold my conversations to meet them at that level, and again, bring them through these stages. Preparation is where, yep, they acknowledge, this is probably one of the most exciting steps of motivational interviewing, is that, yep, they recognize they have a problem and they're ready, and sometimes that takes a whole lot for them to wrap their brain around, to really get prepared for what to come, because it's scary. Action is then they go to treatment. And again, through motivational interviewing, I'm going to prepare them for that, and then I'm going to help them take that action, saying, great, I have here, let's go to this agency. I'm going to have you meet with Steve. He's one of the chemical dependency counselors. You're going to love him. He's a great guy. And connecting with that resource. But again, you're molding those conversations to make them think this was their idea all along. Maintenance is once they've gone to treatment, and then are continuing, it's my job. They're still on probation. It's my job to continue to maintain and motivate them to maintain their sobriety. Motivational interviewing requires them to really confront themselves. And that can be very scary. That can be very, very emotional. It can be overwhelming. But it's really how we get them to the different stages. And again, the beauty of motivational interviewing is through the process, and part of the art and the skill behind the process is I get you to believe this was your own idea. Now, I can't tell you how many folks, after they've successfully completed their probation and then they have to fill out a survey, an exit survey, how many of them say, you know what, Rose didn't do anything for me. I did it all myself. I decided to go to treatment. I did this, Rose didn't do anything for me. And that's perfect. What that tells me, and so really you kind of have to have thick skin. What that tells me is I did my job really, really well. Because again, I have convinced them that this was their own idea. Because if you think it's your own idea, that's going to help motivate you and commit you to this whole change process. All right, then let's shift gears and talk a little bit about intermediate sanctions. Um, Basically, these are things that fill this gap between our lowest level, what might be a slap on the wrist, saying, don't come back here again, all the way up to probation. And so it's a ladder. I like to think of it as a ladder, a continuum. We also call these graduated sanctions, but in this case, graduation up to a higher level isn't necessarily a good thing. But no matter what type of intermediate sanctions, and I'll talk about some of the most popular here in just a little bit, they all basically have similar core values. All of them really focus on that victim. We want to collect as much restitution as we possibly can because, again, that's money that goes back to pay back the victim. We really focus on rehabilitation, getting them the treatment, getting them the help that they need. Reintegration, again, we want to keep them into the community as much as possible. Saving money, again, that's one of our motivating factors for everything. And ultimately, intermediate sanctions really allow us to keep the prison space for those that need it most. So I was saying that it does save money. Now, this slide demonstrates some of the costs of some of our options. So I know many of you are fans reading the discussion forum so far. Many of you are fans of boot camp. Boot camp is extremely expensive. It's also one of the least effective. It has one of the highest recidivism rates of any other intermediate sanction. And again, I'll talk about that in the discussion forum. We see the average cost of prison. That's actually a relatively low number. That's a minimum security prison. Some prisons are upwards of $40,000 a year. Jail, RCC, residential community centers, formerly known as halfway houses, are also still pretty expensive. And we go down the list. So house arrest by far is the most inexpensive option. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these. So the first I want to talk about is intensive supervision probation, kind of near and dear to my heart. But basically this is pretty much, as far as its definition, it's probation, but just has much more supervision. So in a normal or a generalized caseload, again, I might have anywhere between 120 and 200 offenders. When I worked intensive or ISP, I had 30 offenders. But these were very, very high risk, high needs offenders. Now, when we look at as far as evaluations, recidivism rate is about the same for intensive supervision probation. However, one of the things to keep in mind is you also are more at risk of getting caught. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So, if you are seeing your probation officer twice a week versus once a month, it's more opportunity to get caught. Just like if we put more law enforcement in an area, we're going to make more arrests in that area. Not because there's necessarily more crime, just because we've put more resources, as far as police officers, in that area. And so we do see the recidivism rates about the same, but we also have to keep in mind that there's more opportunity to get caught. One of the most important findings about ISP is offenders that stay in treatment. And again, we see about 80% of all offenders assessing as needing chemical dependency treatment. Intensive supervision probation incorporates treatment most of the time. And basically, by having this intensive supervision, offenders are more likely to stay in treatment. And so the findings are very positive there. Drug courts, I've already defined them a little bit. Basically, it's a diversion. It's intensely monitored treatment instead of incarceration. And the bottom line is that it focuses on accountability and sobriety in treatment. And basically, if you successfully complete drug court, depending on the jurisdiction, you might have your charges removed or reduced, or even the penalty reduced. And so the bottom line is the goals, we're really trying to reduce recidivism rates as well as drug use. And we have seen great success with drug courts. All right, fines are pretty self-explanatory. Um, the fine money does not go to the victim. The fine money goes back to the offender. Day fines are basically a modification of fines, and in a lot of ways this makes sense. So let's say you are fined $300 for um, your your fifth degree assault. Um, Based on your income, that could make or break you, or it could be pocket change. And so day fines are a modification of fines where basically they will say, okay, your fine is going to be a maximum of 0.5% or 1% to whatever it is percentage of your weekly wages. And so it's trying to be a little bit more equitable because, again, $300 could be someone's entire wages for the week, depending on their job or how many hours they work. Or it could be pocket change to someone. So day fines are really trying to take someone's income into consideration. Community service, most people are very familiar with what community service is. It actually started in '66 in California, and it's basically unpaid work to support a nonprofit agency. Sometimes we see community service used in combination with other types of sanctions. Being on probation and having 100 hours of community service isn't uncommon. Now, residential community centers are our modern day halfway houses, and I have in and out. So halfway houses basically have two functions. If someone the next step is going to prison, but we're not quite ready, we don't think prison is completely appropriate, or we want to kind of have a wake-up call, so we might send them to a halfway house, so they're halfway into prison. Or halfway houses might be the reintegration process where they're getting out of prison, not quite ready to go home, so we use a residential community center to kind of help that reintegration process. Depending on the area in the jurisdiction, some are going to have programs right on site. Some of them might have a drug treatment program, anger management program, other types of services right on site. Some of them you have to go off site for. Day reporting centers are basically a variation of residential community centers, with the biggest difference is you don't live there. RCCs, you live there. Day reporting centers, you go, and most often it's very, very early in the morning, and you need to register your schedule for the day. Going to work, going to treatments, everything that you are going to be going in that day, when you're going to be arriving, where you're going to be arriving, how you're going to be arriving. It allows us to keep closer tabs on you. For the most part, we can see someone having to report to a day reporting center anywhere between 40 days and 9 months. We generally don't see that going any longer than 9 months, but it allows us to keep closer tabs on individuals and how they're spending their time. Remote location monitoring, fancy name for electronic monitoring or wearing a bracelet. We are seeing some great advances technologically as far as, when I first started using electronic monitoring when I was in the field, if I could get within 100 yards of someone, that was really good. Now we can pinpoint their locations within a building, which obviously can be useful. Again, we use electronic monitoring a lot of times in combination. Some of the criticisms of it, it doesn't monitor very well what's happening in a home. For example, I will openly admit, I had an individual, he was on probation, electronic monitoring, couldn't be out of his house, before 7:30 going to work, had to be back at home by 5:30. He had a huge meth lab going in his basement, but he was home. And at the time, that's the only thing we were worried about. Now, boot camps. A lot of you have mentioned in your posts that you're a big fan of boot camps. Historically, boot camps basically have been around since the early '80s, and started in Oklahoma and Georgia. Now, historically, they were also modeled after the military, where, if you're familiar with the military boot camp, correctional boot camps were based after that philosophy. Now, the target population was very young, first time nonviolent offenders. However, the taxpayers, and again, so many stereotypes and misconceptions, boot camps became very, very popular with the general public. And a lot of people had this idea that, you know what, they know someone that went to the military, went through boot camp, and it completely changed them, and it changed them for the good. And, some will even say, you know what, going to the military saved my life. And, I totally support that, and I see that. The challenge is that the military has a lot of support and a lot of follow through. Correctional boot camps have not had that support and follow through where we have the physical, we break them down, but ultimately, that whole building them back up process that the military does, correctional boot camps haven't done that, mainly because we don't have the time or the resources. And so the traditional correctional boot camps broke them down physically and emotionally and psychologically and then released them. Most boot camps had higher recidivism rates than other options. They made things worse. And so that is why a lot of boot camps have either closed or have been converted to what we call wilderness programs, where they're very, very short programs where someone is in prison and they might be able to have an opportunity to go to this wilderness program and work off some of their time. It's very challenging, talks about accountability, really works at kind of looking at those core values, but is not as intense as boot camps that are within the military. Because again, we've just found them to be ineffective in corrections, and the vast majority of them have closed. But again, they were very, very popular with the taxpayers. Not to mention they're very expensive, and so we're really having to shift kind of the stereotype that is out there. All right, so that wraps up what I have.